Okay, this information is going to be going through practice strategies. Previously, we've spoken about stages of learning, the fact that we have cognitive learners, associative learners, and autonomous learners. Based on those different stages of learning, as well as how complex a skill is, that will determine what type of practice is best suited to those different people. Okay, so practice alone doesn't guarantee that you're going to be able to improve your performance. What you need to be able to do is also take into account the individual, because people learn in different ways. You'll take into account the actual task. Is it a simple task that you need to learn, or is it quite complex? And do we need to actually break it down into different sections to be able to learn that task and then put it all back together? And also the environment, so things like your weather conditions, where you're actually performing the skill, all of those sorts of things factor into what sort of practice you actually do. With these things in mind, the types of practice that we can choose from that I'll talk about are part versus whole practice, distribution of practice, so whether we have massed or distributed practice, and also the variability of that practice, whether we choose to do blocked or random practice. So again, this sort of information is going through how we actually categorize different things. So previously we've categorized based on the skill, how we can classify it. We've categorized based on our learning, stages of learning, and now we're categorizing based on what sort of practice we can do. First one I'll talk about is whole versus part practice. So whole practice would be quite common. You would see this quite a lot because you would practice the skill as it is normally performed, so in its entirety. So an example of this would be in basketball, when you actually drive the ball, doing a layup to the basket and complete it by shooting the basketball into the ring. That is whole practice because you are practicing a skill in its full entirety. If we were to take that same skill and break it down into its sections, that would be part practice, because a learner in their cognitive stage, they're not going to be able to perform that whole skill of driving to the basket and performing a layup. So they would need to, first of all, practice just dribbling the ball, then dribbling with the steps just at the end of the layup, taking off on the right foot to be able to perform that layup. They would practice shooting an angled shot, all of those sorts of things. They're breaking that skill down into its sub-skills, all those sub-routines. So part practice is about breaking it down into those sub-routines, and we need to do this if a skill is complex. So if we've got cognitive people learning a really complex skill, you have to break it down. They're not going to be successful otherwise. Another example of a complex skill that might be broken down would be tennis. So serving in tennis, if you try and do that, it's a very difficult thing. Add into that things like wind, and it becomes even more difficult to do. So by practicing the individual components of that serve, so just the ball toss, that's where a lot of the error happens within a tennis serve. Having a consistent ball toss into the air directly above, so that you can then execute your normal backswing and ball contact and all of those sorts of things. So breaking it down into simple sections to make that something, then we could put it all together and start to use whole practice. So a beginner would use part practice, and then it would become whole practice. The only time we wouldn't do part practice is if you try and break down a skill and it just doesn't make any sense. So if you break something down and try and just do a little section of that skill, but it makes no sense in terms of actually learning that skill, you wouldn't break it down. You would just learn that skill in that entirety. So for golf, for example, you wouldn't learn just to follow through. Okay, you learn golf by doing the entire skill and then learning how to fix those errors that happen throughout that entire practice, that whole practice. So as I was just saying, two factors that need to be considered when deciding if you want to break down a task into part practice the complexity of the task. Is it a difficult task, and does it have several segments that it makes sense to break it down into smaller sections? So the layup example before, complex task if you don't play basketball and you've never done that before. Breaking it down into smaller manageable sections, learning each of those sections, putting it back together makes sense. The other thing I was just talking about was that organisation of the task. How dependent is each segment that you wanted to break it down into on the previous one? If you were to break it down, would it just be too disjointed and not make any sense? So as I said before, just to follow through in golf, there's no point in practicing that because it's not relevant to what you're actually doing in the swing. It doesn't make sense to break it down into sections. So practice that skill as whole practice. Our next way that we can categorize practice, we can have massed practice or we can have distributed practice. So I'll talk about massed practice first. So it is less frequent training sessions, but they're longer training sessions. So it might be just 2 training sessions a week, but they go for a couple of hours. During those training sessions, there's continuous practice and there's not much break in terms of recovery between things that you do within that session. So there's little or no rest between the rehearsal of the skill. You just keep doing it over and over again. So lots and lots of repetition for a really long period of time. The advantages of massed practice is that it maximizes practice time. Okay, with minimal break time, you are working more and more, so you're getting the most out of that time allocated to that practice session. It does suit non-fatiguing, discrete skills. Okay, so something that isn't tiring, that you can do over and over and over again, it does suit it. So in golf, practicing putting over and over and over again, mass practice is suitable. It needs to be done with someone that is a highly motivated performer. If I was to say to you, all right, you need to go and have 200 putts to get that ball in the hole, you're going to lose interest after about 25 because it is so repetitive and monotonous and it's just the same thing over and over again. It doesn't become very challenging. It is physically exhausting, but the main issue with it is that it's mentally exhausting. Okay, so your brain is working the entire time over and over again, doing the same thing over and over again. So it's very repetitious, it's very boring. It might be done if there's less time within that training schedule for the week. Okay, so someone might have other commitments and they can only do 2 or 3 training sessions in a week. So they need to cram in as much practice as possible within that training time. So they're going to choose massed practice. On the other hand, we've got distributed practice. It involves shorter but more frequent training sessions. So they might do training every day or do split training sessions across one day. So they might train in the morning and the afternoon and focus on different things. More or equal time is spent resting between practicing skills. Okay, so they would practice, and then have a break that's a pretty similar time. And that allows that retention of understanding of the skill. Okay, so you can take in what you've learnt before moving on to the next stage. So practice is in shorter intervals, and it has recovery periods amongst those intervals. The good thing about distributed practice is that you have more engagement with your learners. Okay, so shorter concentration time required, and that means that there's going to be less time where you're doing the same thing over and over again that people lose interest. Short bursts of concentration, that's going to increase engagement because you only need to have that attention span for a shorter period of time. It's really good for beginners. Small chunks of information, allow that to absorb before moving on to the next thing. And it's also good for those performers that aren't as motivated. Okay, so mass practice, we spoke about the fact that you're doing the same thing over and over again. With this, it's just little snippets and then you can go do something else. There's less fatigue during practice because you're not practicing for as long, so you can perfect technique, and that can help with doing things like learning a complex skill because you're not learning it under fatigue, and you can process and learn that information before moving on to the next part. So it allows that memory consolidation. The disadvantages with distributed practice is that it is more time consuming. Okay? If you're practicing every day, that does add up to a lot of time versus 2 nights a week. It's probably less suited to discrete skill rehearsal. Okay, so discrete skills where there's a distinct start and end, it's not going to be as suited for that type of practice. Okay, so it is better for things like continuous practice or serial practice, serial skills, sorry. So just continuous skills or serial skills. And that's to do with the fatigue associated with those sort of things. So in gymnastics, for example, you might learn bits of a routine and put it all together, but you would do that throughout several sessions rather than all at once. Blocked versus random practice. So blocked practice is learning the exact same skill continually. So this is really good for someone in the cognitive stage because they're trying to learn and reproduce a particular action. When someone's in the cognitive stage, I've spoken about the fact that we want to close down that skill. So if we're closing down that skill and doing the same thing repeatedly, so within a training session, it might be, okay, you're going to do 50 free throws in a row now. That particular 53 free throws is blocked practice. So blocked practice could happen in either a massed training or distributed training. It could happen in either of these two things. We want to close down that skill and do it in a stable environment so that we quickly learn the skill. Then we would start to open it up and add other factors so that they can apply it to different situations within a game. Random practice, on the other hand, is having varied sequencing of different skills in the same training session. Okay, so this is good for those in the associative or autonomous stages, and they're going to have a better understanding of how to use those skills in different game situations. So they're going to be better prepared for gameplay. Okay, it is random. There's no set order as to how you would do things. So in volleyball, it could be dig, set, dig, spike, spike, set, dig, etc. That is random practice. So there's no set rules as to what you would do. If it was 5 sets, then 5 digs, then 5 blocks, all of those sorts of things, that's still block practice because it's doing the same little block before moving on to the next block. So block practice, same thing repeatedly. Random practice, different things in a random order.
Skills and short duration.
Alright, so this video does show an example of blocked practice. So you can see that the basketballer here is shooting the same shot 5 times in a row to practice that skill. It was very specific because they were preparing for a 3-point competition, then moves around to the next spot. He would do that, say 6 times in a row, and then move around to the corner spot as well. So it's doing the same thing over and over again. You can see that it could get quite tiring because of that repetition of doing the exact same movement time and time again. But the benefits is that you are really getting a feel for what you need to be doing to perfect that skill and execute it to a really high standard. In terms of block versus random practice, studies show that if you're learning a skill, you should do blocked practice. This is going to allow you to perfect that skill, and then you can start to apply it to different contexts. So then you would do random practice once you've done that. So initially, blocked practice will see the greatest improvements, but then once you know that skill, if you're just doing blocked practice, you're actually going to plateau in terms of your performance and how you improve, and you're not going to retain that information. So you're not going to learn as much. So the skill doesn't improve. Once you get to the associative stage, random practice is what you need to do. because that's going to allow that further improvement. So initially, blocked practice will see the quickest improvement. Random practice would be then what you would do afterwards so that you can see further improvement, so that you don't have a plateau in that skill level. Overall, that will lead to a higher level of skill retention. So your understanding of how to do that skill and what's required to do that skill in different contexts. In terms of transfer of practice, any practice that closely resembles what you do in an actual game is going to lead to greater transfer of skills from training to gameplay. So if you practice game set plays and vary the conditions under which you do something, like say keepings off in terms of creating space and moving free in a game like netball or basketball, that's going to mean you'll have greater skills in the actual game to be able to get into space to receive a pass. So practice games, if they're done all of the time, you're not going to improve your skill development, because it can get boring to say, all right, training, we're just going to do a practice match, and it decreases motivation and you increase your risk of injury. But it's modifying factors that you would use. So if someone's in the cognitive stage, reduce some environmental factors that might be present in the game normally. So having little kids moving the basketball as a team from one end of the court to the other and scoring without defenders is a good use of transfer of practice, because they're learning how to work together as a team to reach the goal of getting the ball into the hoop. In the associative and autonomous stage, they're going to benefit more from practice that resembles some component of the game. So they might look at what the defending team normally does in terms of their set plays and start to develop plays to go against that. So there's a tactical element to the practice that they're doing. Okay, so they're learning how to create their tactical understanding and develop their thinking strategies and the way that they think throughout the game, so they make better decisions. And we'll talk a little bit more about a games-based approach to coaching a little bit later in another session. In terms of the amount of practice, in the cognitive stages, there's quick improvements. Okay, so if there's lots of practice given to someone in the cognitive stage, they won't spend very long in that stage. They'll improve quite quickly and progress to that associative stage. So you can see that there's that steep acceleration initially when someone starts to practice a skill. As they progress through the stages of learning, their rate of improvement will slow down or will diminish. Okay, so when we look at training in Unit 4, we have this concept of diminishing returns, and that's the higher we get to our fitness potential, the harder it is to improve our fitness. The same goes with our skill levels. The higher we get to being perfect in that skill, the harder it is to improve. Okay, so initially you make very big, quick improvements in skill when we're in the cognitive stage, and as we progress from the associative to the autonomous stage, that rate of improvement will slow down. It's important that coaches understand this so that they can maximize practice sessions, keep their players on task, make sure the practice that they're doing is quite relevant to their stages of learning. So in summary, coaches should generally consider the fact that the more you practice, the more you're going to learn, but that meaningful practice time needs to be taken into account. In terms of engagement for our learners, need to make sure that there's a sense of when it's best to stop working on one skill and move on to the next activity. Okay, so as teachers, for example, we try and get an understanding of what your level of understanding of a particular concept is, and once we know that you've got it, we're going to move on and build on to that. That's the same sort of thing that coaches should be doing. Focus on learning that skill. Once there's understanding, add to the complexity of that skill. Apply it to different situations. Also be aware of the principle of diminishing returns. Okay, so understanding that for someone in the autonomous stage, they're probably going to get frustrated because they're not seeing any further improvements. So trying to work around that is something that a coach would need to be able to do. So in terms of whole versus part practice, we've got practice the whole skill versus breaking it down and practicing parts of the skill. Mass versus distributed, less frequent training sessions a week versus more frequent training sessions per week. And then blocked versus random, repetition versus random order. Those are the things you need to be able to consider if you were to plan a practice routine for someone in different stages of learning. Okay, so if someone was in that cognitive stage, we want to break it down into part practice. We want to have distributed more frequent training sessions, and we want to make sure in those training sessions the skill is blocked, that we have that repetition of repeating that skill over and over and over. If there are any issues with any of these concepts that I've gone through, make sure that you come and find me and we can have a chat about it, and I can run extra revision sessions if there's lack of understanding of these concepts, especially after we do a couple of practice sessions in relation to both practice and feedback.